Nobody expected a 20-year-old in a faded hoodie to outsmart an entire courtroom, but Marcus Tate was about to rewrite the script. The air inside the Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta, Georgia, hung heavy thick with the weight of judgment and the faint hum of anticipation. Rows of spectators packed the gallery, their whispers weaving a tense undercurrent as they eyed the young man at the defendant's table. Marcus stood alone, his hands stuffed casually into his pockets, his chin tilted just enough to signal he wasn't intimidated. To the world, he was just another kid in trouble accused of stealing a 2023 BMW and leading police on a chase through downtown. But to Marcus, this wasn't just a trial, it was a stage, and he'd been preparing for it his whole life. A 20-year-old kid in a hoodie took on a courtroom and exposed its flaws. Marcus Tate, dismissed as a criminal, fought back with brilliance, unraveling a case built on bias. His story isn't just about winning, it's about challenging a system that judges too quickly. Will his courage change justice forever? Stick around to witness a battle that proves one voice can make a difference. Judge Evelyn Harper presided over the courtroom, her sharp gaze cutting through the room like a blade. At 58, she'd seen it out, so she thought. Her lips curled into a faint, dismissive smirk as she peered over her glasses at Marcus. "You think you're here to play games, Mr. Tate?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't a schoolyard debate. This is a court of law." A ripple of chuckles spread through the room. Bailiffs, stenographers, even the prosecutor joined in, as if Marcus's mere presence was a punchline. But Marcus didn't flinch. His dark eyes met hers, steady and unflinching, a spark of defiance buried beneath his calm exterior. He wasn't laughing, he was waiting. The charges were serious: grand theft auto and evading arrest. On paper, it looked like an open and shut case. The prosecution claimed Marcus had been caught red-handed, his fingerprints plastered on the stolen car's steering wheel, his name tied to a reckless chase that ended in a dramatic arrest. To Judge Harper, Marcus was just another statistic, another young man who'd made bad choices in a city where trouble seemed to find kids like him. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming lazily against the polished mahogany of her bench, already mentally checking out for her afternoon coffee. "Let's keep this moving," she sighed, flipping open the case file with a flick of her wrist. "I've got a schedule to keep." The gallery murmured in agreement, their eyes flicking between Marcus and the imposing figure of Prosecutor David Langley, who rose from his seat with the air of a man who'd already won. Langley's suit was tailored to perfection. His tie knotted with military precision, his voice carrying the rehearsed polish of someone who delivered this speech 100 times before. He was the picture of authority, and he knew it. But Marcus saw something else crack in the facade. A flicker of overconfidence that only someone who'd spent years studying the law would notice. And Marcus had studied. While other kids his age memorized rap lyrics or chased scholarships, Marcus had pored over case law, dissecting trials like a surgeon. His mother, a court clerk for over 2 decades, had brought home stories of flawed justice, biased rulings, and defendants who never stood a chance. Those stories weren't just bedtime tales, they were fuel. The weight of the moment pressed against Marcus's chest, but it wasn't fear, it was resolve. He felt the sting of every chuckle, every sidelong glance that dismissed him as a nobody. Each one sharpened his focus, like a blade honed against stone. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for every kid who'd ever been judged before they opened their mouth. Judge Harper's words echoed in his mind. This isn't a schoolyard debate. She was wrong. This was exactly that, a debate. A battle of wits, and Marcus had been practicing his whole life. As Langley began his opening statement, outlining the undeniable evidence against him, Marcus let his lips curl into the faintest of smiles. The courtroom hadn't noticed yet, but the game had already begun, and Marcus Tate was about to change the rules. In the dim glow of a single desk lamp, Marcus Tate had built an empire of knowledge that no one in the Fulton County Courthouse could have imagined. Growing up in Atlanta's West End, where the hum of the city was punctuated by sirens and dreams often fell out of reach, Marcus was different. Not because he was louder or flashier than his peers, but because he was quieter, focused in a way that made people pause. At 20, he was a sophomore at Morehouse College, juggling classes and a part-time job at a local diner. But his real education happened late at night, in a cramped apartment where his mother, Clara Tate, shared stories that shaped him into the young man now standing defiantly in a courtroom. Clara had been a court clerk for 22 years, her hands worn from filing endless case documents, her eyes sharp from witnessing the justice system's triumphs and failures. She'd come home with tales of trials gone wrong, prosecutors who twisted facts, judges who favored efficiency over fairness, and defendants who crumbled under the weight of a system that didn't see them. Marcus, barely 10 at the time, would sit cross-legged on the living room floor, soaking in every word. While his friends traded Pokemon cards or shot hoops, Marcus was memorizing the Fourth Amendment, piecing together legal arguments like a puzzle only he could solve. By 14, he could dissect a trial better than most first-year law students, running mock arguments in his head, playing both prosecutor and defense. Clara called him "my little lawyer," half joking, half proud, but Marcus felt the weight of those words. They weren't just a nickname, they were a calling. The courtroom didn't know this. Marcus, the one who'd spent years building a fortress of legal knowledge to shield himself from a world that too often judged him by his skin or his zip code. To Judge Harper, he was just a kid in a hoodie, another name on a docket. But every smirk, every chuckle from the gallery stoked a fire in Marcus's chest. He wasn't angry, not in the way that clouds judgment. His was a controlled burn, a resolve forged from nights spent studying case law while his classmates partied, from the sting of being followed in stores, from the quiet pride of knowing he was smarter than the system assumed. This trial wasn't just about a stolen BMW. It was about every time someone had looked at him and seen less than he was. Marcus's passion for justice wasn't born from textbooks alone. It came from Clara's stories of defendants who'd been railroaded, people who looked like him, who'd never had a chance because they didn't know the rules of the game. He'd lie awake at night, imagining himself in their shoes, vowing to rewrite their endings. Law school was his dream, but not the kind that came with a corner office or a fat paycheck. Marcus wanted to be the kind of lawyer who made the system flinch, who forced it to see the people it so easily discarded. Standing in that courtroom, he felt the weight of that promise pressing against his ribs, a mix of fear and exhilaration. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every kid who'd ever been written off, for every story Clara had brought home. As Prosecutor Langley's voice boomed through the courtroom, laying out the irrefutable evidence, Marcus stood still, his hands still in his pockets, his face unreadable. The gallery saw a nervous kid. Judge Harper saw a nuisance. But Marcus saw something else, an opportunity. He'd spent years preparing for a moment like this, not this exact one, but one where the truth hung in the balance, and he was the only one who could tip the scales. The laughter from the courtroom stung, but it also sharpened his focus. He wasn't here to prove he was smart. He was here to prove the system was wrong. And as Langley's words echoed, Marcus's mind was already 3 steps ahead, mapping out the cracks in the case, ready to tear it apart. The Fulton County Courthouse pulsed with the kind of tension that made the air feel alive, and Prosecutor David Langley was its maestro. As he stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, every eye in the room followed him. Marcus Tate, the 20-year-old standing at the defendant's table, felt the weight of those gazes, but he didn't waver. Langley's voice, smooth and commanding, filled the room like a tide, washing over the jury, the spectators, and Judge Evelyn Harper, who leaned forward in her chair, her earlier smirk replaced by a look of quiet approval. To the courtroom, Langley wasn't just presenting a case, he was weaving a story, one where Marcus was the undeniable villain. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Langley began, his tone measured but forceful, "the evidence before you is as clear as day. On the night of the 12th of June, 2024, Marcus Tate was caught behind the wheel of a stolen 2023 BMW, speeding through the streets of Atlanta. When police attempted to stop him, he fled, leading officers on a dangerous chase that ended only when he was apprehended." He paused, letting the words sink in, his eyes sweeping the jury box. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, irrefutable proof of his guilt. The state will show, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Mr. Tate is responsible for grand theft auto and evading arrest. The gallery stirred, whispers rippling like a current. To the spectators, the case seemed airtight, a tidy narrative, crime and consequence. Jurors nodded subtly, their faces hardening as they glanced at Marcus, who stood with his hands still tucked in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Judge Harper tapped her pen against her desk, her eyes flicking between Langley and the case file, as if the verdict was already written. The public defender assigned to Marcus, a frazzled woman named Karen Ellis, scribbled notes frantically, but her nervous energy only deepened the room's confidence in Langley's story. To them, Marcus was already guilty, a young man who'd made a reckless choice and now faced the consequences. But Marcus saw the cracks. He'd spent years studying trials, learning how prosecutors like Langley wielded words like weapons, how they leaned on assumptions to fill gaps in evidence. The irrefutable fingerprints? Marcus knew they were only half the story. The chase? He hadn't been in that car, not when the sirens blared. Yet the weight of the room's judgment pressed against him, a familiar ache that echoed every time he'd been sized up by a store clerk or a neighbor who crossed the street when he passed. It wasn't just anger that simmered in his chest, it was a quiet, burning resolve, the kind that had kept him up late reading case law while his mother slept, the kind that had pushed him to dream of a courtroom where truth could outweigh bias. Langley paced before the jury, his gestures sharp and deliberate. "The defense may try to spin a tale of misunderstanding," he said, casting a pointed glance at Marcus. "But let's be honest. Innocent people don't run from the police. Innocent people don't leave their fingerprints on stolen property." His words landed like blows, and a few jurors shifted in their seats, their eyes narrowing at Marcus. The prosecutor's confidence was magnetic, pulling the room into his orbit. Even Karen Ellis seemed to shrink, her pen pausing as if she'd already conceded defeat. The gallery buzzed, some spectators leaning forward, others murmuring about kids these days. Marcus felt the sting of those words, the way they painted him as a stereotype rather than a person. But he didn't let it show. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "They'll underestimate you, Marcus. Use it." Clara's stories had taught him that trials weren't just about evidence, they were about perception, and Langley was playing that game masterfully. But Marcus had his own playbook, one forged in years of studying the system's flaws, of imagining himself in this very moment. As Langley returned to his seat, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, Marcus took a slow breath. The prosecution's case might look airtight, but Marcus knew even the strongest walls could crumble with the right push, and he was ready to start pushing. The Fulton County Courthouse held its breath as Prosecutor David Langley sat down, his smirk a silent declaration of victory. The jury's eyes lingered on Marcus Tate, their gazes heavy with the weight of the Airtight case just laid out: fingerprints, a chase, a stolen BMW. Judge Evelyn Harper adjusted her glasses, her expression a mix of impatience and certainty, as if the trial's outcome was already etched in stone. Marcus, still standing at the defendant's table, felt the room's judgment like a physical force, pressing against his chest. But beneath his faded hoodie, his heart beat steady, fueled by years of preparation and a fire that no smirk could extinguish. This was his moment, and he was ready to seize it. The public defender, Karen Ellis, rose hesitantly, clutching a thin stack of notes. Her voice wavered as she began. "Your Honor, my client." But Marcus placed a gentle hand on her arm, a silent signal. She froze, her eyes wide with confusion, then slowly sank back into her chair. A murmur rippled through the gallery, a mix of curiosity and amusement. Marcus stepped forward, his posture calm but unyielding, and spoke in a voice that cut through the room's tension like a blade. "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself." The courtroom went still. Judge Harper's pen paused midair, her eyebrows arching in disbelief. Langley let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, quickly masked as a cough. The spectators exchanged glances, some stifling chuckles, others leaning forward, sensing a spectacle. To them, Marcus's declaration was reckless, the act of a desperate kid out of his depth. But Marcus wasn't desperate. He was calculated. His mind racing through years of mock trials he'd argued in his head, of case law he'd memorized while his peers chased fleeting thrills. This wasn't bravado, it was belief, rooted in the countless nights he'd spent studying the system that now sought to crush him. Judge Harper leaned forward, her voice laced with skepticism. "Mr. Tate, do you understand the gravity of what you're saying? This is a serious case, and you're not a lawyer." Her words carried a warning, but also a trace of curiosity, as if she sensed something beneath Marcus's quiet confidence. Marcus met her gaze, his dark eyes steady. "I understand, Your Honor, and I'm ready." His tone was respectful but firm, a subtle challenge that made the room's laughter falter. Langley's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. The gallery's whispers grew louder, the air electric with anticipation. Inside, Marcus felt a storm of emotions, pride, fear, and a fierce determination that burned brighter than ever. He thought of his mother, Clara, who taught him that the law was a battlefield where preparation could outshine prejudice. He thought of every defendant she'd described, people who'd lost because they didn't know how to fight. This was for them, too. The weight of their stories steadied him, grounding his nerves as he faced a room that had already judged him guilty. He wasn't just defending his freedom, he was defending his right to be seen, to be heard, to be more than a stereotype. Judge Harper exhaled, rubbing her temple. "Very well, Mr. Tate. Proceed at your own risk." Her words were a formality, but her eyes lingered on him, searching for a crack in his resolve. She found none. Marcus nodded, his hands finally leaving his pockets as he adjusted his stance, claiming the courtroom as his own. The spectators shifted, some still skeptical, others intrigued. Langley crossed his arms, his confidence shaken but intact. But Marcus saw the opening a moment to turn the tide. He'd spent years preparing for a stage like this, and now, with every eye on him, he was ready to rewrite the narrative. The laughter had stopped. The real trial was about to begin. The Fulton County Courthouse crackled with a new kind of energy as Marcus Tate stood at the defendant's table, his decision to represent himself still echoing in the stunned silence. The laughter that had once rippled through the gallery was gone, replaced by a taut anticipation. Judge Evelyn Harper's skeptical gaze bore into Marcus, but he met it with a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle her. Prosecutor David Langley, his earlier smirk now a tight line, shuffled his papers, sensing the shift in the room. Marcus, the 20-year-old college student dismissed as a mere kid, was about to turn the trial on its head, and the weight of that moment fueled every beat of his heart. Marcus took a slow step forward, his voice steady but resonant, cutting through the courtroom's tension. "Your Honor, before I proceed, I'd like to address the prosecution's evidence." He turned to Langley, his eyes sharp. "Mr. Langley, you stated that Officer Michael Brennan personally witnessed me driving the stolen BMW during the chase. Is that correct?" Langley nodded, his tone clipped. "That's what the report says, Mr. Tate." Marcus gave a slight nod, then faced Judge Harper. "Your Honor, I move to verify Officer Brennan's GPS logs from that night. If he saw me, his location should match the chase's timeline. But I suspect it won't." A murmur swept through the gallery, heads turning as spectators exchanged glances. Langley's jaw tightened, his confidence faltering for a split second before he recovered. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he said, his voice sharp. "Are we to question the integrity of a sworn officer based on a defendant's hunch?" But Marcus didn't flinch. "If the officer was where he claimed, the GPS will prove it," he said, his tone calm but unrelenting. "If not, the jury deserves to know." Judge Harper's brow furrowed, her pen tapping the desk as she studied Marcus. After a long pause, she nodded. "I'll allow it." "Counselor, provide the logs." Langley hesitated, the brief pause speaking louder than words, and Marcus felt a surge of vindication. The first crack in the prosecution's case had appeared. He wasn't done. Turning to the jury, Marcus softened his voice, making eye contact with each juror. "The prosecution also claims my fingerprints on the BMW steering wheel prove I stole it. But let's think about that logically." He paused, letting the room lean in. "Imagine you're at a mall, trying on a pair of sunglasses. You touch them, put them back, and leave. Later, someone steals those sunglasses. Does your touch make you a thief?" A few jurors shifted, their expressions softening as the analogy sank in. Marcus continued, his voice steady but laced with conviction. "That BMW was parked outside a gas station hours before it was stolen. I was there with friends, getting snacks. I leaned against the car, even touched the handle because it was unlocked. A dumb moment, sure, but not a crime." The gallery buzzed, some spectators nodding as Marcus's words painted a different picture. Langley scrambled, flipping through his notes, but Marcus pressed on. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist who analyzed those fingerprints called to testify? Judge Harper glanced at Langley, who cleared his throat. No, Your Honor, he admitted. His voice strained. Marcus's lips pressed together, a spark of triumph in his eyes. So, the state wants to convict me based on evidence we can't even question? No chain of custody, no cross-examination, no accountability? Inside, Marcus felt a storm of emotions bride in his preparation. Anger at the system's carelessness, and a fierce hope that the jury was listening. His mother's stories of defendants buried by unchecked evidence echoed in his mind, urging him forward. The courtroom was no longer laughing. It was riveted, hanging on his every word. Judge Harper's skepticism had softened, replaced by a grudging curiosity. Langley's polished facade was cracking, and Marcus knew it. He'd spent years studying the law's intricacies, and now, in this moment, he was wielding that knowledge like a blade, carving through the prosecution's case with precision and purpose. The Fulton County Courthouse was a pressure cooker, its silence so thick it seemed to hum. Marcus Tate stood at the defendant's table, his steady gaze sweeping the jury, the gallery, and Judge Evelyn Harper, whose earlier skepticism had morphed into a wary focus. Prosecutor David Langley, his once polished demeanor fraying at the edges, gripped his pen tightly, as if it could anchor his unraveling case. Marcus had already chipped away at the prosecution's foundation, questioning the officer's testimony and debunking the fingerprint evidence, but he wasn't finished. The 20-year-old, dismissed as a kid in a hoodie, was about to deliver a blow that would shatter the courtroom's assumptions and expose the truth buried beneath layers of bias. Marcus took a deep breath, his voice calm but carrying the weight of years spent studying the law. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence a statement from the owner of the stolen BMW, Mr. Thomas Caldwell. A ripple of surprise passed through the gallery, heads turning as spectators whispered. Judge Harper's brow furrowed, her pen pausing. The owner? She asked, her tone sharp but curious. Marcus nodded, pulling a printed document from his file. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Caldwell provided a statement to the police the night his car was reported stolen, statement the prosecution failed to include in their filings. Langley's face stiffened, his eyes narrowing as Marcus held up the paper. Your Honor, this is irrelevant, he began. But Marcus cut through, his voice steady but piercing. Irrelevant? Let's see what Mr. Caldwell said. He read aloud, each word deliberate. I left my car running outside the gas station for just a minute. Someone jumped in and took off. I saw the kid. It wasn't the guy you arrested. The thief was white, shorter, maybe 16 or 17. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. The jury shifting in their seats, their eyes darting between Marcus and Langley. Marcus held the document aloft, his voice rising with controlled intensity. This is from the original police report, Your Honor. The prosecution had it. They chose to ignore it. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some spectators shaking their heads, others scribbling notes. Marcus's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a fierce vindication. He thought of his mother, Clara, who'd spent years warning him about cases like this, cases where evidence was cherry-picked to fit a narrative, where people like him were convicted, not for what they did, but for who they were. The sting of being misjudged, of being reduced to a stereotype, fueled his resolve. He turned to the jury, his eyes locking with theirs. I'm not the person Mr. Caldwell saw. I wasn't in that car. I was arrested blocks away, walking home with friends after grabbing snacks. The only thing tying me to this case is a lazy investigation and assumptions about who I am. Langley scrambled, his voice rising. Your Honor, the defendant was found near the scene with fingerprints on the vehicle. But Marcus shook his head, his tone unwavering. Near the scene isn't in the car, Mr. Langley. And touching a handle isn't stealing. Judge Harper leaned forward, her expression unreadable, but her eyes fixed on Marcus. The room felt smaller, the air charged with the weight of a truth too long suppressed. Marcus felt a swell of emotion relief that the jury was listening, anger at the system's carelessness, and a quiet pride in his ability to fight back. He'd spent years preparing for a moment like this, not as a defendant, but as someone who could make the system see its flaws. The prosecutor's case was crumbling, and everyone felt it. Langley's polished confidence had dissolved into a flushed, defensive posture. The jury, once swayed by his narrative, now looked at Marcus with new eyes. Judge Harper cleared her throat, her voice measured. "Mr. Tate, you've made a serious claim. The court will review this statement." But her tone carried a shift. A recognition that Marcus wasn't just a kid, he was a force. For Marcus, this wasn't just about winning. It was about exposing a truth that could save others from the same fate. The real thief had slipped away, but Marcus was done letting the system pin the blame on him. The Fulton County Courthouse seemed to hold its breath, the weight of Marcus Tate's revelations hanging in the air like a storm about to break. The jury sat riveted, their earlier certainty replaced by doubt. Prosecutor David Langley's polished facade had cracked, his hands fumbling with papers as he struggled to salvage his case. Judge Evelyn Harper, once dismissive, now leaned forward, her eyes locked on Marcus, the 20-year-old who turned a routine trial into a reckoning. The gallery buzzed with whispers, but Marcus stood steady, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and resolve. He'd exposed the truth, the suppressed statement from the car's owner, the flawed investigation, the bias that had nearly buried him. Now, the room waited for the system to answer. Judge Harper adjusted her glasses, voice measured, but carrying a new weight. "Mr. Tate, you've presented compelling arguments and evidence that cannot be ignored." She glanced at Langley, whose flushed face betrayed his defeat, then back at Marcus. "The prosecution's case rests on assumptions that do not hold up under scrutiny. This court finds insufficient evidence to proceed." She paused, her gavel hovering, then struck it once. The sound sharp and final. "Case dismissed." A beat of stunned silence followed, then chaos erupted. Half the gallery gasped, some in disbelief, others in quiet awe. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture the moment. Jurors exchanged glances, some nodding, others staring at Marcus with newfound respect. Langley slumped in his chair, his head bowed, while the public defender, Karen Ellis, looked at Marcus with a mix of shock and admiration. But Marcus didn't move. He let the moment wash over him, the weight of his victory sinking in. It wasn't just freedom he'd wanted, it was vindication, a chance to rewrite the narrative that had branded him guilty before he'd even spoken. Inside, Marcus felt a torrent of emotions. Relief flooded his chest, but it was tempered by the ache of what he'd endured, the laughter, the judgment, the system's readiness to discard him. He thought of his mother, Clara, whose stories of broken trials had prepared him for this fight. He thought of the defendants she'd described, people who'd lost because they lacked his knowledge. This victory was for them too. Standing in the courtroom, Marcus felt a clarity he'd never known before. This wasn't just a trial, it was a calling, a confirmation that his dream of becoming a lawyer wasn't just a goal, it was a necessity. The system needed people like him, people who could make it see its flaws and demand better. Judge Harper cleared her throat, her voice softer now, almost reluctant. "Mr. Tate," she said, her eyes meeting his, "you have a remarkable mind. You should consider law school." The words hung in the air, a concession from a woman who'd once mocked him. Marcus gave a small nod, his lips curving into a faint smile. He didn't need to consider. I'd known his path since he was a boy, sitting at his mother's feet, listening to her stories. But the judge's words carried a weight, an acknowledgement that Marcus had forced her to see him, truly see him for the first time. As the courtroom began to empty, Marcus gathered his papers, his movements deliberate. The gallery stirred, some spectators lingering, others rushing to file their stories. Langley slipped out quietly, his defeat etched in his posture. Marcus felt no malice toward him, only a quiet determination to ensure others wouldn't face the same fight. He glanced at the jury, their faces a mix of awe and reflection, and knew his words had reached them. This wasn't just about one case, it was about a system that too often failed, and his role in changing it was just beginning. As he stepped toward the exit, the weight of the trial lifted, replaced by a fire that would carry him forward, not as a defendant, but as a force for justice. The steps of the Fulton County Courthouse buzzed with chaos as Marcus Tate emerged into the Atlanta sunlight, the weight of the trial lifting like a fog burned away by dawn. Reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like spears. "Mr. Tate, did you expect to win? What's next?" How does it feel to outsmart a prosecutor? The questions came fast, but Marcus pulled his hoodie over his head, his focus elsewhere. This wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about something deeper, something that had taken root years ago in a cramped apartment where his mother, Clara, had taught him the power of truth over bias. As he descended the steps, he saw her waiting, arms crossed, her face a mix of relief and pride that made his chest ache. Clara's eyes met his, and for a moment, the world faded. "You scared me half to death, Marcus," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He scratched the back of his head, a sheepish grin breaking through. "Had to take a chance, Ma." She shook her head, then pulled him into a tight hug, her strength grounding him as the cameras kept flashing. In that embrace, Marcus felt the weight of his journey, not just the trial, but the years of late nights studying, the sting of being underestimated, the fire that had driven him to stand up when the system expected him to fall. This victory wasn't just his, it was Clara's too, and it was for every person who'd ever been judged before they had a chance to speak. From Marcus's perspective, the trial had been more than a fight for freedom. It was a mirror held up to a system riddled with flaws. He'd seen it in the prosecutor's cherry-picked evidence, in the officer's unverified claims, in the judge's initial dismissal. But he'd also seen hope in the jury's shifting eyes, in Judge Harper's reluctant respect, in the truth's power to break through. The experience had solidified his calling. He wouldn't stop at law school. He'd become a lawyer who fought for those the system overlooked, ensuring no one else would face what he had without a voice. The trial had tested him, but it had also shown him the impact one person could make when armed with knowledge and courage. Across the street, Judge Harper stood by her car, watching Marcus and Clara. Her usual stern posture was softer, her expression reflective. She'd expected a routine case, another guilty plea, but Marcus had forced her to question her assumptions. She wouldn't forget him, and neither would the system he'd challenged. For Marcus, that was the real victory, not just the dismissal, but the ripple effect. How many others had been convicted because of bias or shortcuts? How many lacked the tools to fight back? The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't a guarantee. It was a battle, and it needed warriors like him to keep it honest. Outro. Marcus Tate's story isn't just about one trial, it's about the power of standing up, of refusing to let the world define you. It's a reminder that justice belongs to everyone, but only if we demand it. His courage shows us that one voice, armed with truth, can shake a system and inspire change. So take a moment to reflect. Who else is out there, fighting battles we don't see? Let's keep their stories alive. If Marcus's journey moved you, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and push us to do better. Together, we can amplify the voices that need to be heard. Don't miss the next one. It might just change the way you see the world.